December 23rd, 1944. The frozen air above Bastogne carries the acrid scent of cordite and wood smoke. In the ruins of what was once a Belgian tavern, steam rises from the breath of wounded American paratroopers lying on makeshift stretchers. Outside, German artillery pounds the encircled town in methodical intervals, each explosion sending tremors through the shattered stone walls. Private Vincent Speranza of the 101st Airborne Division kneels beside his wounded friend, Joe Willis, whose uniform is torn and blood-stained from shrapnel wounds received 3 days earlier during the German offensive. The sound that will echo through history begins not with the roar of engines or the crack of rifles, but with the gentle gurgle of Belgian beer flowing into an American steel helmet. It is a sound that will transform not only the wounded men huddled in that bombed church, but eventually the understanding between enemies who had spent months trying to kill each other. This moment in Bastogne represents far more than one soldier's compassion for his wounded comrades. It crystallizes a fundamental contrast that would define the American experience in World War II. The abundance of a democracy at war against the scarcity of totalitarian regimes. When German paratroopers, the elite Fallschirmjäger who had conquered Crete and terrorized Europe, eventually encountered American prisoners and prison camps, they would discover something that challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies. They would discover that Americans shared their beer. The German offensive that had trapped Speranza and his comrades in Bastogne was born from desperation. By December 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. The Battle of Stalingrad had bled the Wehrmacht white a year earlier. Soviet forces were driving toward Berlin from the east. American and British forces had liberated Paris and were pushing toward the Rhine. The once mighty German war machine was sustained now by teenage conscripts and elderly Volkssturm militia, their rations reduced to ersatz coffee made from acorns and bread stretched with sawdust. German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, had entered the war as the embodiment of Nazi military superiority. These were the men who had seized Rotterdam and The Hague in minutes during the 1940 campaign, who had captured. By the winter of 1944, reality had begun to intrude upon this mythology. German rations had deteriorated from the hearty portions of 1939 to a subsistence diet that provided barely 2,000 calories per day. A typical German soldier's daily ration included 700 grams of bread, when available, a small portion of ersatz sausage, margarine made from industrial fats, and coffee that bore no resemblance to the Colombian beans they had known before the war. Cigarettes, when they could be found, were harsh tobacco mixed with leaves and paper that fell apart in wet weather. The contrast with American abundance was stark and undeniable. While German soldiers counted individual cigarettes as precious commodities, American GIs received full packs as standard rations. A typical American K-ration contained not only substantial portions of meat, crackers and chocolate, but luxuries that German soldiers had not seen in years: real coffee, sugar and chewing gum. American paratroopers carried gear that German infantry could only dream of: waterproof matches, individual first aid kits containing actual morphine, and personal items that spoke to a nation whose industrial capacity could afford to care for its soldiers' comfort as well as their survival. Vincent Speranza embodied this American abundance in microcosm. Born into an Italian immigrant family on Staten Island, he had grown up during the Great Depression, understanding scarcity. But he had also grown up in a democracy that, even in its darkest economic hour, had never subjected its people to the systematic privation that characterized life under totalitarian rule. When he volunteered for the paratroopers after witnessing a training demonstration at Fort Benning, he joined an elite unit that reflected American industrial might. Every paratrooper equipped with the finest gear American factories could produce, trained with live ammunition that other armies hoarded, transported across the Atlantic in ships so numerous they turned the ocean into a highway. The irony of Bastogne was that American abundance persisted even in siege. While the 101st Airborne was surrounded and cut off from supplies, the town still contained resources that would have amazed German soldiers. Belgian beer still flowed from taps in bombed taverns. American medical supplies, though running low, still included morphine and sulfur drugs that German medics. When Speranza filled his helmet with Belgian beer and carried it to the wounded Americans in the church, he performed an act that captured the essence of American military culture. This was not a soldier hoarding resources for himself, but sharing abundance, even in extremity. The wounded men he served had been told they might die from alcohol if they had abdominal wounds, yet Speranza brought the beer anyway, trusting in their judgment and honouring their request for comfort in what might be their final hours. The transformation that this act represented would become clear only months later, when the war's momentum shifted decisively. As German forces retreated and increasing numbers of Fallschirmjäger found themselves captured by American forces, they encountered a phenomenon that shattered their ideological foundations: American generosity toward enemies. Obergefreiter Hans Müller of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was captured near Cologne in March 1945. Like thousands of his comrades, he expected execution or, at best, starvation in Allied prison camps. Nazi propaganda had prepared German soldiers for Allied brutality, describing Americans as gangsters controlled by Jewish financiers who would show no mercy to captured German troops. Instead, Müller found himself in a processing centre where American MPs offered him a cigarette, a full lucky strike, not the ersatz tobacco he had smoked for months. The cigarette was followed by a meal that included white bread, real meat, and coffee made from actual coffee beans. American guards watched German prisoners with casual indifference rather than the hatred Müller had expected. When he asked, in broken English, why the Americans were feeding their prisoners so well, a young sergeant from Ohio replied, "Because you're hungry, and we got plenty." This simple exchange encapsulated a worldview that German soldiers found difficult to comprehend. The Nazi ideology that had sustained them through years of war was built on the premise of eternal struggle, the survival of the fittest, the necessity of conquering or being conquered. Yet here were Americans who seemed to wage war without hatred, who possessed abundance so great they could afford generosity toward enemies who had spent years trying to kill them. The documentation of these encounters fills thousands of pages in American military archives. German prisoners consistently reported the prisoners were allowed to form their own orchestras, publish newspapers, and maintain gardens. They played football and baseball, learned English, and some even earned college credits through correspondence courses. Hauptmann Friedrich Richter, a Fallschirmjäger officer captured during the Battle of the Bulge, spent 18 months at Camp Carson in Colorado. In a memoir written decades later, he described his astonishment at American abundance. "We were given chocolate bars as casual snacks, the same chocolate bars that American soldiers carried into battle. We received cigarettes of the same brands that American troops smoked. The guards shared their coffee during breaks, and when German prisoners complained about the quality of their meals that would have been luxurious by German standards of 1944, the camp commander actually made improvements to the menu. The beer that Vincent Speranza carried in his helmet in Bastogne had become, by 1945, a symbol of American plenty that German prisoners encountered daily. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, German POWs worked alongside American civilians in local factories and farms. They were paid in script that could be used to purchase beer at the camp canteen. Many German prisoners wrote home describing American prison camps as more comfortable than their own barracks had been before the war. This abundance was not accidental but systematic, reflecting American production capacity that German planners had consistently underestimated. While German factories struggled to produce ersatz substitutes for basic necessities, American industry was so prolific that it could afford to treat enemy prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers. American beer production continued throughout the war at levels that would have seemed impossible to German brewers operating under severe material restrictions. American cigarette manufacturers produced billions of units annually, so many that cigarettes became informal currency and occupied Europe. The psychological impact on German prisoners was profound and lasting. Lieutenant Wolfgang Zimmermann of the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division, captured in Normandy in August 1944, spent the remainder of the war at various American camps. In a 1995 interview, he recalled, "We had been told that Americans were soft, that democracy made them weak and selfish. Instead, we found people who were strong because they were generous, who were confident because German paratroopers, who had expected to be treated as war criminals because of their elite status, found themselves engaging in conversations with American guards about families, homes, and hopes for the future. American soldiers shared photographs of their girlfriends and wives, asked about German families, and expressed genuine sympathy for the destruction war had brought to German cities. The beer that had begun as Vincent Speranza's act of compassion toward wounded Americans evolved into a broader symbol of American values in action. At countless POW camps across the United States, German prisoners gathered in canteens where they could purchase American beer with earnings from their labor. They drank Budweiser and Schlitz, brands they had never heard of before the war, served in quantities that would have been unimaginable in wartime Germany. These experiences created cognitive dissonance among German prisoners that ultimately transformed their understanding of the war they had fought. They had entered the conflict believing in German superiority and American decadence. They discovered instead that American abundance flowed from principles they had been taught to despise: democracy, capitalism, and individual liberty. The very weaknesses that Nazi ideology condemned, Americans' concern for individual welfare, their reluctance to sacrifice everything for the state, their belief in human dignity regardless of nationality, had produced a society capable of extraordinary generosity, even toward its enemies. The transformation was not universal or immediate. Some German prisoners remained committed Nazis who interpreted American kindness as weakness or manipulation. But for many, the daily experience of American abundance and generosity planted seeds of doubt about everything they had been taught. They began to question whether the master race that could not feed its own soldiers was truly superior to the democracy that could afford to share beer with its enemies. The symbolic power of beer in this narrative cannot be overstated. Beer represented comfort, civilization, the simple pleasures that make life worth living. When German soldiers saw American prisoners sharing their beer rations, when German POWs discovered they could purchase beer in American camps, they encountered a worldview that prioritized human happiness alongside military necessity. This was incomprehensible within the Nazi framework that glorified sacrifice and suffering as virtue. As the war drew to its close, many German paratroopers who had begun the conflict as true believers in Nazi ideology found themselves fundamentally changed by their encounters with American abundance. They had discovered that strength could coexist with generosity, that victory did not require the dehumanization of the defeated, that abundance shared was not abundance lost, but abundance multiplied. The story that began with Vincent Speranza filling his helmet with beer in besieged Bastogne rippled outward through thousands of individual encounters between Americans and Germans. Each German prisoner who received cigarettes from American guards, each POW who drank American beer in camp canteens, each captured soldier who was treated with basic human dignity, despite having spent years as an enemy, carried home a piece of American values that would outlast the Third Reich. In the decades following the war, as Germany rebuilt itself as a democratic nation allied with the United States, many former German soldiers would point to their treatment as American prisoners as their first encounter with democratic principles in action. They had seen totalitarianism's promise of strength and order collapse into scarcity and brutality. They had witnessed democracy's supposed weakness transform into a form of power they had never imagined, the power to win not only battles but hearts. The beer that Vincent Speranza carried in his helmet on that frozen December day in 1944 had become something more than refreshment for wounded soldiers. It had become a symbol of abundance shared, of humanity maintained in the midst of mechanized slaughter, of values that proved stronger than ideology. When German paratroopers encountered American beer rations, they encountered the essence of what they had been fighting against, and discovered it was not weakness but strength, not decadence but decency, not the corruption of democracy but its triumph. The final irony was that the abundance German prisoners experienced in American camps was not extraordinary by American standards but routine. The beer, cigarettes, chocolate, and decent treatment they received were simply extensions of how Americans believed human beings should be treated. The generosity that so amazed German POWs reflected values so fundamental to American society that Americans themselves barely noticed them. In this light, Vincent Speranza's helmet full of beer becomes more than a touching anecdote about battlefield compassion. It becomes a metaphor for the American approach to war itself, a democracy that could afford to maintain its humanity, even in humanity's darkest hour. A nation whose abundance flowed not from conquest, but from the principles that made conquest unnecessary. The German paratroopers, who were stunned by American generosity, had encountered something more dangerous to totalitarianism than any weapon. The living proof that freedom and abundance were not contradictions, but natural partners in the human experience. The echoes of that December day in Bastogne would resonate long after the last shots were fired, in the rebuilt cities of Germany, in the NATO alliance that transformed former enemies into allies, in the democratic institutions that German veterans helped establish in their homeland. The beer that Speranza shared had become, in its way, the taste of victory, not victory through conquest, but victory through the patient demonstration that human dignity and abundance could coexist, that strength and generosity were not opposites, but reflections of the same fundamental truth about what makes civilization worth defending.